So welcome to Bald Spot Garage. We're continuing work on my 2003 Astro van. Now the last video, we stripped all this stuff down and cut out this old rusty Corsa part. Now this video, we're going to start rebuilding it. So you may look at this and say, where do you start? It's a good question, and that depends on your skill level and how you think about things. Now what I started to do is take these and reposition them, figure out where they were sitting originally, to try to figure out the shape. Has all this stuff bent? And is it sitting where it needs to be as my starting point, so I know what it's supposed to look like? So then I looked at, how am I going to actually build this thing? How am I going to shape each piece? And most importantly, how am I going to keep the dimensions and keep things from moving around and changing shape while I'm cutting things apart and working on it? We don't want to just cut the whole bottom of the thing off and then try to rebuild it as one big piece, because we can lose reference points. My decision was start with this piece here. I'm going to replace the bottom section of this, but leave this in place, and we'll grind off all of this. Once this is welded in place, that should keep these dimensions, then I can start working on this front piece. So I started with making a pattern of the bottom of this thing to try to get the shape. Now this is just cardboard that is actually used between layers of like toilet paper and paper towels at the big warehouse stores, and you can go in there and you can ask for that, and they'll generally just let you take whatever you want. Good for patterns, easy to cut. So in this case, I started by trying to make sure this was sitting where I thought it should actually be at. And I took a dimension, I started off the bottom of these holes to give me a nice straight line across here, and cut me a piece of that cardboard and figured out what my radius was going to be on either side and got the width right. So I measured the thickness of the metal on the course board, and it checked out with paint to be 19 gauge. Now I got a bunch of 20 gauge lying around. It's not the best looking materials. It's kind of old. It's got some rust spots, but it doesn't matter on this case. I just hit it with some wire brush. It'll be good. I don't plan on keeping this thing for 20 years anyway. So I transferred the dimensions onto another piece of metal here and added 3/4 of an inch for the flange all the way around. Now this is not going to be a detailed step-by-step how-to of every single piece I put together. But what it is going to do is it's going to show you that with some relatively basic fabrication tools, in terms of fabrication, I'm not using any real expensive equipment here, but still have some stuff like this that not everybody's going to have. But with some basic tools and some knowledge and some thinking, you can build this stuff and do a pretty decent job of it if you really try. So this goes to show you, you don't need a bunch of fancy equipment. You can make do with what you have laying around. So I'm using an old brake rotor here to true up this edge. Now it's not the exact same shape that I'm looking for. It's smaller radius, but you can still do that just fine by just working it around the rotor. Now this old thing here it's pretty old. It's probably about 100 years old. It is not actually the right one for what I need to do, but something that's getting me close enough. But because this is shaped the way it is, it ends up leaving me a little bit of a radius here rather than a sharp edge. But that's perfectly fine, because that actually pretty closely matches the radius on the core support. So I think that matches up close enough for what we're doing here. So now what I'll do is I'll take my pattern here and I'll put this here, get it all lined up exactly where I had it to begin with. And then I'll mark this radius in here because this side's still good. And then I'll flip it over and mark the radius again here. And then we can cut that out, connect the dots, and that gives me this. Transfer that to here, cut that out, and we got ourselves a piece to weld in. So there's my pattern. We'll transfer that to here and cut this out. Now, why did I wait till now to cut this out? Well, because turning this flange up, it's easier to keep all this stuff flat if this has more meat in it to start with. If I trim that all the way down to there, this would warp a whole lot more. So it's just a controlled warpage. Now, I am not using anything more exotic to cut all my metal today than just a cheap 4.5-inch grinder with a cutoff wheel and a pair of aviation snips. So I went ahead and put that on there, scribed it out, cut that out, trimmed away all the extra bits of rust, got it clamped in place and welded in. Now, we got to look at this front part here. I have bent up a little test piece to try to get my measurements figured out for this piece here. And it's close enough to do what we need to do. So I'll go ahead and make a piece that's going to be long enough to go across here. And then I'll cut this out and put that in. So what I did to make these radiuses is I made a series of marks roughly 1/16 inch apart, did 4 of them and made 4 bends for each and just divided that up. So, 90-degree bend, you'd want, 22.5 each bend, or like this here was like about a 75-degree bend. So I did roughly, 19 each to get that radius, and that comes close enough to be, good for what we're doing to the radius that was originally on there. So it's a little tighter radius, but whatever. So then I'll clamp this on here and we can weld this up. Now I did go ahead and spray the insides of this with some etch primer. Now the reason I used etch primer is because I don't have any weld through primer right at the moment. Now you can go ahead and plug weld this, just drill a bunch of holes in there and plug weld it. But I just happen to have a little 110 spot welder, so I will use that. Well, when I decided to start making this piece here, I didn't turn the camera on because I was actually just kind of playing to try to figure out how I was going to make it, and I really didn't think that the piece I was going to start with was going to be good enough, and then I could actually make it work. But I made it work well enough. Does it look exactly like the piece that came out? No. Was it close enough? I think so. Because now when you're trying to do a piece like this, you make a Z out of it, and then you shrink the one side, to pull it in and then stretch the other. But the hard part about this is the radius here. That makes it way more difficult because, especially since this is stowed up pretty straight and this is canted, the radius actually needs to stretch a little bit for it to be right. So I was just trying to, see if I could make it work, and I did. So next we'll be making this back side here. I have been, along the way, been playing a bit to try to make sure like this is going to end up where I want it to be. And I have verified that this sits where I want it to sit for this all to line up. I know what my height is from here down to there, so I can duplicate that. So the next piece I'll make will be a piece across here, just from here to there. So it's basically just an L, shrink the edge, and then make it all fit, weld it up. All right, so now I got that piece fitted, trimmed up, and welded in place. And it was at this point that I decided it was time to stop, go pick up some parts and some hardware in order to move on to the next step. So I went and got the mounts that go onto here. Those are readily available from Dorman, part number 924192. They're roughly $50 at your local parts store a piece. So I went to the hardware store, picked up some nuts that fit these bolts. And what I'll do is I'll make all new brackets of these. I'll make them out of maybe 12 gauge or something, that's what the thickness is. And then we'll weld that nut to the back side of that. There's no way we're going to get this apart and reuse this. And once I weld that into there, then this hole here will get opened up big enough to make sure that the nut and the weld around the nut will fit through there so that we can then slide that in place and then weld that on. And also, while I was at the hardware store, we needed nuts and bolts to hold these on because the bolts really weren't that good anyway. So we got some nuts. I ended up getting square nuts because that's what they had in stock, and some flange bolts to put in here for both sides because this holds the corner of the bumper. And there's a bracket that goes down the center of the grill here. So I located that hole that was supposed to be there, drilled that out, then bought some flanged nuts, drilled it out just big enough for that nut to go in there but not drop through, and then weld around it. And then if you want to make sure it's flush, you can just pop it with a hammer and it'll kind of dimple down and go more flush. And I picked up a new bolt while I was there because while the old bolt came out, it wouldn't go back into a nut. So the other thing we're going to have to deal with before we can put anything back together is the mounts tend to hold a lot of water between them here, and they're pinching on either side of the frame rail, so this hole gets rotted out. And they're expanded once they're bolted down tight, and the holes in the frame rails tend to open up to the point where the new mounts just drop right on through. So while I was at the hardware store getting the nuts and everything for this, I took it with me and went and found some big washers that were big enough to go over top these mounts. Now this mount goes like this and pinches the rail in between them. And it's okay that these are a little loose because I think they were actually loose from the factory. I don't think you want them really tight. This is just a 2-inch washer. So what we can do then is you can come in here and you can trim some of this out, and then you can cut the edges of the washer to fit in there and weld it in. Or you could realistically probably just clean this up, set it on top, weld it around, and it would still work just fine. But for $4 and something per washer, it sure beats trying to sit here and use a hole saw and stuff to try to cut new pieces and make it all work. But once you put that in there, that'll fit in there just fine, and then we can actually put this thing back together. Now we're starting to prepare the van to accept the repaired core support. So I'm starting out with taking my 2-inch washers and actually cut this edge to match kind of the curve on the frame rail here, and then put this over top and scribed around it, cut all that out, and we can set this back in place, hold it with a magnet, and then I can tack it in and finish welding it. Do that to the other side and the mounts will be taken care of. So it's been a day or two since I've actually worked on this because we did something else yesterday. It wasn't in the shop at all, but it's humid out right now. So we're getting some flash rust all around where we've been working, and that's a common thing to happen. And when that happens, I did find a pretty decent product that works really well here. It's Fast Etch by Eastwood. No, I am not at all sponsored by Eastwood. I mean, I am a brand new channel after all, but if Eastwood is watching and they would be interested in talking to me, I'd be willing to talk to them. But at any rate, I'm not even using this the way they're supposed to use it, but you can just put it on here. You're supposed to let it sit for a while, but when it's a fresh flash rush like that, that stuff comes off really easily and it won't come back. So now I still have to finish the back side of this side before I even go start working on that side. But the rot come up just high enough that I ended up taking the radiator support bracket off of it. I didn't want to, but it was just in the way. So what I decided to do was I just drilled out all of the spot welds, knocked it off, cut it just halfway up. Once I finish repairing all of this, I can locate this right back on those 3 holes and then scribe through these 3 holes for locating. Then I can take it off and plug these welds up and then put it back on and weld it back in place. Now after taking this off, of course there's more rust behind there than what you could see. So now I'm just planning out how I'm going to rebuild this area right now, and then we can start moving forward. Close enough. Get tacked in there, and we can start on the piece from here going across. All right, so now I got the back side of this all put together and got this support bracket made up and put in place. And yeah, I know I kind of skipped a little bit on some of the stages of this. When we get to the other side, I think I'm going to try to show a bit more of that. Now, part of the reason for me even doing this project at all is because a lot of this stuff is skills that I either haven't really tried to do or I haven't done in a long time. So it's learning for me of how to do things better or to improve the skills I already have, which is why when I do this other side over here, I'm actually going to use different techniques. I'm going to put it together in a different way than I did this in order to, say, kind of add to that toolbox of skills or improve the skills that I have. Because a lot of this stuff is stuff that I generally know how to do, but I've got limited practical experience in actually doing it. And part of the purpose of the whole channel here is to kind of push outside of that comfort zone, learn new things, brush up on skills, and encourage others to jump in and try it. Because if you don't jump in and do it, you're never going to learn. But as far as the other side's concerned, that will be the next video. I'll work on getting that side done and then getting it back into the van and finishing up some stuff on that.